Demerara. Why on earth should a meeting of this society be looking at Demerara? Well, just over 200 years ago, a family came to this area of Devon after making its fortune in Demerara, and subsequently attracted people from Woodbury and Clisson Mary to go to Demerara. For those versed in the history of Woodbury and the surrounding areas, this story may fill a few gaps. The story is basically all about sugar, and this sachet of Demerara sugar is of considerable significance. Its importance will be revealed later. So where is Demerara, the land from which the brown sugar takes its name? I am sure that you all know that it is part of Guyana, a land which has marvellous wildlife such as this, and was in the days of the British Empire known as British Guiana, or more affectionately BG. It is not in Africa. It lies on the north coast of South America, between Venezuela and Suriname. To the south lie Brazil and the Amazon. The interior contains spectacular forests and mountain ranges, and is best known for the Kaieteur Falls. The coast where the plantations were is a different world. One writer, looking back after many years there, said the things which impressed him most on arrival were the mosquitoes and the deafening noise of the frogs. So who went to Demerara? First, Thomas Porter, who planted cotton. Second, in the time of his grandsons, two Stokes brothers and a Matthews. Third, the Ebbels brothers. And finally the Bethunes and Strongs, who had clerical links with this area. First, a brief background to this land where these people went. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company received a charter to run a colony on the banks of the Essequibo River. The Dutch also had a colony on the Berbice River. The third river, the Demerara, was not settled until the middle of the 18th century. After a short-lived occupation by the French, Demerara and Essequibo became territory of the state of the Netherlands. When the Netherlands came under the rule of a regime allied to Napoleon, the French threat rose again. So in 1795, Britain sent ships and soldiers and took over Demerara, Essequibo and Berbice, which was ceded to Britain by treaty in 1814. This is a view of Georgetown, the capital, in the 1830s. The town came into being 50 years before, during the French occupation, when traders and free residents established themselves at the mouth of the Demerara River. No town existed before 1781 because slavery relied on the plantation system's close control of the workforce. In the 1800s, the town, then called Stabroek, was described by a Scots planter as an ugly, abominable place, with no paved streets, just a canal of stagnating, stinking water, with a track on each side. A century later, it had become an attractive city. This aerial view shows Georgetown today, a conurbation of some 200,000 people. The first settlements in Demerara were on the banks of the river, while most of those built in the upper reaches eventually returned to bush, and some became timber grants. However, 60 miles up the Demerara River was Christiansburg. It began life as a sugar plantation in 1746 and later became a sawmill, and in the 20th century was the centre of bauxite mining. It was here that would-be planters arrived from Britain, North America and the West Indian Islands. However, by the 1770s, cotton plantations were being laid out on the sea coast. Here it was said cotton of very good quality was ready for picking 7 or 8 months after planting. The cotton bonanza was underway. The number of bales of cotton arriving in British ports from Guyana increased more than fourfold between 1796 and 1804. Massive warehouses such as these gory piazzas were built in Liverpool to store colonial goods. One good cotton crop in 5 could make a planter's fortune. A gentleman called Fraser of Belladrum was said to have made £40,000 by his last trip. However, by no means were all planters successful, but there was money to be made. It may surprise you to learn that for a short period at the end of the 18th century, Guyana was the greatest cotton producer in the world and the greatest coffee grower in the British Empire, both products based, of course, on slavery. But by 1830, the USA was supplying 3/4 of Britain's cotton needs. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire, combined with the competition from the USA, where slavery continued until 1863, made the growing of cotton and coffee in Demerara no longer profitable. The last bale of cotton was exported in 1843, and coffee exports virtually ceased in 1846. These crops had given way to sugar, but after 1815 sugar had also suffered a serious fall in price. By 1850 the coastal plantations not under sugar had become cattle farms or been abandoned. The plantations had one unavoidable cost, and that was drainage. This is an old coker, the Guyanese name for a sluice. When the planters with their slaves laid out their beautiful estates, communications were better by boat than by road for much of the year. Why? Because the Demerara coast, to a depth of several miles, is flat and in some areas below sea level. It can be very wet here, with an annual rainfall of 132 inches, 11 feet, which did happen in 1893. They had 25 inches of rain in 1 month in 1879. That's more or less our total annual rainfall here. To cope with such torrential rain, the Dutch created canals and sluices, through which water was let out to sea at low tide. At the mouth of the Demerara River, planters faced cycles of erosion and accretion of the foreshore. A mud dam, faced with stone, was built from the river mouth as far as Turkey End, to protect the plantations on the coast. The sea had broken through here on many occasions and even wiped out some small plantations at the end of the 18th century. In 1886 it was to do it all over again. Here you can see the general layout of the plantations, all parallel and side by side. Many still had Dutch and French names, and others were named after places in England from whence the English planters had come. Now the people. Who were the aforementioned porters? We start with Thomas Porter I, born in 1748 in Enmore near Bridgewater in Somerset, where his father was a landowner. I've been told that Thomas went to Demerara from Barbados, and that it was in Barbados that he married his wife Sarah. This is likely to be correct, but there is just a chance that he may have gone to Demerara via the island of Tobago, because he had a plantation there called Perry Wood in Bloody Bay. A Scotsman, Colonel Fraser of Belladrum, also had interests in Tobago, and Thomas Porter must have arrived in Demerara during the 1770s, when it was still in Dutch hands, and he would have been there during the French occupation. He wrote a letter from Demerara in 1784, when he was struggling to make his fortune as a cotton planter. His many plantations would have looked a bit like this one, Malgré Tout. Their names were Hope, Paradise, Adventure and Enmore, Enmore after his Somerset home. Thomas was listed as their owner in 1785. He was also, of course, an owner of slaves. It is said that there were about 680 slaves on the estates Paradise, Hope and Enmore in 1813. A Guyanese historian reckoned that a sugar plantation with 200 slaves required a capital of £20,000 and produced a net annual profit of £3,500. Even if the estates were fully mortgaged at 10%, this left a net profit of £1,500, with minimal living costs. Lord Seaforth's return of 3,000 on an investment of 12,000 was even better. We can only wonder how much Thomas Porter made. This slide shows the location of Mulgrave Toot. Porter's estates were some 10 miles away and grouped in this area. This is Enmore, Hope and Paradise. After 30 years in the West Indies, Thomas Porter returned to England in the late 1790s, and he and his wife Sarah and their 6 children settled at Rockbere. All the children were below 10 years of age, and all apparently were born in Demerara. The youngest child was baptised at Rockbere in 1801, when she was about 5 years old. Thomas, who acquired property in several Devon parishes, was Sheriff of the County of Devon in 1804. He bought and rebuilt Rockbere House, and one of his daughters married Henry Bidgood of the Rockbere Court family. The families may have been related by marriage, which could explain their coming to Rockbere, or they could have been acquainted in Tobago, because Henry Bidgood was born there. Among the improvements added by Thomas at Rockbere were pine houses and a peachery. These were fashionable additions, and a pinery was built at Nutwell Court in the same decade. When his eldest son married in 1812, Thomas gave him Rockbere and property in Aylesbury and Broadclyst. When Thomas died in 1815, he was buried at Rockbere, where a memorial was placed inside the church. In today's terms, Thomas's assets must have amounted to over £20 million. He left his West Indian estates to his sons Thomas, Henry and William as tenants in common. Henry and William also received all his property in Somerset. His 3 daughters got £30,000 each, and his wife Sarah received an annuity of £3,000 during her lifetime. After the death of Thomas, Sarah went to live at Dawlish Manor, but when she died in 1823, she was at her London house, 13 Berkeley Square. With the plantations, we now enter the absentee years of 1800 to 1830, when no porter appears to have been in Demerara. We now move on to Thomas II, who was born there in Demerara and educated at Eton. He married Mary Lee, daughter of Thomas Heathfield of Upper Nutwell. This I am sure you will now recognise as the Nutwell Lodge Hotel. This is where my sachet of sugar came from, and is where many of those who would later go to Demerara would meet and discuss the logistics of getting there and what they would do when they got there. The sachet has in effect done full circle, and quite appropriately come back to the place where a large part of this story probably started. From Woodbury to Demerara, and from Demerara back to Woodbury. However, Thomas II seems to have preferred to be a country gentleman, and he transferred his 1/3 share in the Demerara estates to his eldest son in 1845. In the 1850s, Thomas's family was known to be living in Exmouth, where the neighbours included 2 sets of teshie makers, who were another planting family from BG. When he died, Thomas, like his father, was buried at Rockbere. He left his Limestone property to his son George, who was the rector of Limestone, and later of St Leonard's in Exeter. The close associations which existed in the colonies, and particularly in a small planting community, continued after the family returned to England. Thomas II's brother William went to Blundell's School, Tiverton, in 1804, and then to Edinburgh. He graduated from St John's College, Cambridge, in 1818. However, he died in 1821, when only 25 years old. The 3rd brother, Henry, was educated at Eton and Brasenose College, Oxford, and he also studied at Lincoln's Inn. After receiving William's share, Henry became the major shareholder in the family's Demerara estates. The heirs of Henry Porter still owned Enmore and Paradise into the 20th century, and for many years owned Le Souvenir, which was bought by Henry in 1840. Whilst Enmore was now a sugar estate, the small Paradise estate was still producing more coffee than sugar. Henry Porter was a very wealthy man, and in 1820 he married Rose Aylmer Russell, sister of Whitworth Russell, who was at St John's with his brother. Her parents were Sir Henry Russell, seen here, and Anne Barbara Whitworth. Rose would certainly have added considerably to Henry's resources. He obviously got on with Henry Russell, being one of the trustees for certain provisions in Russell's will. To marry Rose during her father's lifetime, Henry would have had to have been rich and white. He and Rose lived at Winslade House near St Mary, where they had 10 resident servants in 1851. Most of their children were baptised at St Mary, where Henry was buried when he died in 1858. Rose died in Dawlish in 1880. A brief return to Guyanese history for a moment. Following the abolition of slavery, many Africans avoided the plantations and created villages of their own, becoming subsistence farmers. This African village is in an East Coast district, once full of cotton plantations. The first free village established after emancipation was Victoria Village on the East Coast, formed in 1839 by 83 ex-slaves from 5 nearby estates, including Hope, Paradise and Enmore, who pooled their resources and bought the abandoned plantation Northbrook. Only 16 years earlier there had been a slave insurrection on this coast. The Reverend John Smith, a London Missionary Society clergyman who was blamed for the revolt, was pilloried by the plantocracy for, among other things, seeking to teach slaves to read. He was sentenced to death but died in prison. For Souvenir, the plantation bought by Henry Porter in 1840, had been at the heart of this insurrection. While many planters were harsh in their dealings with slaves, there was nothing to suggest that the slaves on Enmore and Paradise were badly treated. There were no porters in Demerara in the first 30 years of the 19th century, yet some Negroes on Plantation Paradise had attended chapel for over 12 years, and a good many had been baptized. In the insurrection, most of the porters' slaves seem to have kept their heads down. Indeed, when the Reverend Mr. Austin was on the coast, they invited him to come and remain with them for their security, and they were quiet and peaceable. On Porter's Hope plantation, which had a different attorney, things were not so good, and next door there took place a skirmish known as the Battle of Bachelor's Adventure. I mention this to introduce a man called Leonard Strong. While I do not know what the Porters' views on slavery and Africans were, the family did at least have one liberal connection. The patron of the living at St Mary was the Reverend Thomas Strong. His family had 3 links with the Porters and Demerara. Firstly, his son, Edmund Strong, who was the rector of St Mary, was given the living of Limestone by Thomas Porter. Secondly, Edmund's daughter Constance married Henry Porter's son, the Reverend Reginald Porter, rector of Ken. And thirdly, a nephew of Thomas Strong, the Reverend Leonard Strong, a man of substantial means who had served in the Royal Navy in the West Indies before entering the church, had spent many years in Demerara. Leonard Strong, newly ordained, arrived in Demerara in 1826, 3 years after the slave revolt, to serve in the Anglican parish of St Mary. Among his parishioners were 2 liberal-minded planters, Dr. John Austin and John Reed. Strong, who married a sister of John Reed, officiated at the marriage in Demerara of his wife's niece to Dr. Austin's son. However, while a nephew of Dr. Austin later became the first Bishop of Guyana, high Anglican connections were of no interest to Strong. After the abolition of slavery, he left the church to become a missionary among the Africans. He joined the Plymouth Brethren, who were known in Demerara in 1848 as Strongites. As a Brethren website puts it, they were breaking bread in Georgetown earlier than in Dublin or Plymouth. He must have been heartily disliked by many planters, but he was much loved by the Africans, and on his return to England he settled in Torquay. We now come to Thomas Porter III, who resumed the family's direct involvement with its estates, and this is the scene which have greeted him as he entered the Demerara River. This is a print from the 1830s. Tom, as he was known, was the most important member of the family in planting terms. After Eton and Oriel College, Oxford, he arrived in Demerara in about 1835, when slavery was in the process of being abolished, which was a difficult period. His father and uncle were absentee owners, but Tom stayed for 25 years and took an active role in the colony. As an acting stipendiary magistrate in 1845, the 83 freed slaves I mentioned earlier appeared before him to sign the Articles of Agreement for the local government of Victoria Village. In 1848 he was a member of the Court of Policy, the colony's governing council. He was also a director of the Demerara Railway Company Limited. In 1845 he was a member of the Committee of Management, selected to supervise the construction of the East Coast Railway, which reached Enmore in 1850. In 1841 the small family estate Paradise produced coffee, sugar and rum, and cotton production had all but ceased. However, Enmore, which included Porter's Hope Plantation, had been a sugar estate since the 1820s. In fact, in 1841 Enmore produced more sugar than any other estate in Demerara. It also made quite a lot of rum. After 20 years or so, Tom sold his minority interest in both Enmore and Paradise, and in 1852 he bought Plantation Farm on the east bank of the Demerara River. This was close to two well-known sugar estates, Diamond and Peters Hall. He managed farm himself for a few years, but later took into partnership an excellent planter, Alan McCalman. Tom had married well. His wife Charlotte was the daughter of William Wolseley, the colony's assistant government secretary, whose uncle Sir Charles Wolseley was a Staffordshire baronet. Unfortunately, the price of sugar collapsed in 1884, and many estates went to the wall, and many planters were ruined, and Tom's partner Alan McCalman committed suicide. Soon after this tragedy, Tom sold farm to the Demerara Company, which amalgamated it with Plantation Diamond, then the largest in BG. His side of the Porter family from that point no longer had an interest in Demerara, and Tom died in 1897. However, 5 of Henry Porter's sons, the chap who lived at Winslade, continued to own sugar estates until about 1900, when all the estates except Enmore and Paradise were sold. Henry Aylmer Porter, the eldest of the 5, was a JP for Devon when he lived in Dawlish. By 1902, when he died, he and his wife were living in Berkshire. Whitworth Porter, the second son, probably the most distinguished member of the family in his generation, was a professional soldier, who rose to be a Major General in the army. He was in the West Indies in 1849 and again in 1874-6, when he was commanding Royal Engineer at Barbados. He may well have taken these opportunities to visit Demerara. He was the author of the History of the Knights of Malta in 1883 and the History of the Corps of Royal Engineers in 1889. Another son, Ludovic, known to his friends as Ludo, was in Demerara between 1856 and 1868. He served as a member of the Court of Policy and as a Special Justice of the Peace. By 1860 he had taken over from his cousin Tom as attorney of the Henry Porter estates and was living at Paradise House. He added to his sugar interests by buying another plantation, Cane Grove, with a mortgage provided by Booker's. Although he took into partnership his attorney and manager, a young and talented planter named Franklin, Cane Grove did not make Ludo a fortune. In 1879 his share reverted to Booker's to secure the debts due to the firm. Franklin stayed on only to die of yellow fever 3 years later. Ludo married Maria Hole, a daughter of the Reverend George Hole, sometime rector of Chumley. After the death of a baby daughter at Paradise House in 1867, Ludo and Maria returned to England, and Ludo died in London in 1904. Their older son Charles Ludovic, who became Sir Ludovic Porter of the Indian Civil Service, served briefly as acting governor of the United Provinces in 1922. The other children of Henry interested in sugar estates were Reginald, the rector of Ken, who married Constance Strong, Morton, the youngest son, who became a colonel in the Royal Artillery, and in the 1880s their sister Caroline. So that's the basic Porter story. The Porters were of course plantation owners. We now come to the men they attracted to work on their plantations. Slavery had ended in BG in 1838, and after abolition, labour was obtained through the importation of indentured labourers. The first came from Madeira, Germany and Malta, the last two being conspicuously unsuccessful because they arrived during a yellow fever epidemic. The main sources of indentured workers were later to be India for about 80 years, and for a few years China. All the managers and overseers were always European. The first son of Woodbury attracted to Demerara was Henry Thomas Stokes, known as Harry. It is not difficult to see how Harry became a sugar planter. Thomas Porter II was patron of the living in the parish of Limstone. His son Tom, the active planter in the family, may well have visited Woodbury after his father's death in 1857, when Harry Stokes would have been 17. Several West Indian planters were then living in the area, among them the Porters in Winslade and Exmouth, the Teshamakers in Exmouth, and the Bidgoods in Newton Abbot. Harry would certainly have known the Porters and maybe all three families. The opportunities in the tropics could have been mentioned by any of them, assuming Harry or his father did not raise the question first. So, about 1860, Harry went to work on a sugar plantation. What would they have found there? First, an attorney, a bit like a modern-day land agent, who looked after plantations for absentee owners and saw that they were run honestly and, wherever possible, profitably. Then the king of the estate, the manager, who controlled the lives of all who worked on it. He often ran the place for his own benefit as much as for the benefit of the owner, and would have, for example, his own cattle farm, providing another income, using estate supplies to achieve it. A small group of overseers or foremen, on small plantations maybe only 3 or 4, supervised the work in the fields and the sugar factory. Drivers or headmen ran the gangs which worked in the fields, and were often brutal in the way they did it. The gangs were African labourers, or more likely by Harry's time East Indian indentured immigrants. The system was often cruel and oppressive, and the plantocracy and the colonial authorities controlled every aspect of life. While some plantation overseers were fair and reasonably decent in their behaviour by our standards, many treated the labour force abominably. They, the overseers, were generally living a life in Demerara far superior to that which they had known in Britain. The risk was disease, especially yellow fever and malaria, that which they had known on farms in Britain. Harry was an overseer for the Porters at Enmore when he was 21. When he had settled into plantation work, he married. His wife Marion was the daughter of James Cook, who lived at Enmore and was the engineer for about a dozen East Coast sugar factories. Cook had been in BG for many years, being one of the earliest engineers in Demerara. This photo, taken about 1875, illustrates, with the carriage and servants, how Europeans saw themselves in the community. You can see that Marion was not of wholly European ancestry. Like many older residents, James Cook had a mixed-race partner, Sarah, who was described in the 1901 census as his widow. It is likely that the Cooks were married, although not being married to your non-white partner had been the norm up until the 1840s. The children of mixed partnerships were often treated as second-class citizens by their white relatives, particularly if the family was moving up the social scale. Harry arrived when Ludo Porter was the attorney, and the manager, a Cornishman named Cowsar, was about to retire after running Enmore for over 30 years. You can see from this photo of the manager's residence that the manager always lived in a grand manner. Harry must have done well, because when J.S. Gordon took over Cowsar's role at Enmore, Harry succeeded him as manager of Resouvenir. Fortune then really smiled on Harry. Josias Booker had married a daughter of Bishop Austin. Gordon, whose wife had died, married a cousin of Mrs. Booker, and he, Gordon, became a partner in and manager of the Booker family's plantation, Greenfield. So the door opened again for Harry. Before he was 30, he succeeded Gordon at Enmore. The Porters must have had great confidence in Harry for him to follow in the footsteps of Cowsar and Gordon, who were very successful planters. This photo was taken at Enmore in about 1875, and it shows Harry the manager with his overseers. Marion is sitting next to him, and behind her stands her father, James Cook. In front of Cook, next to Marion, is her mother, Sarah. As an illustration of a top-class estate in Harry's time, this is Leonora on the west coast, one of the best estates in its day. It belonged to the Sandbach, Parker and Tinn families of Liverpool, and was the home of William Russell, one of BG's most famous planters. Writing at the end of the 19th century, J.A. Tinn gives a glimpse of life similar to that which Harry would have enjoyed at Enmore. Leonora has without doubt one of the finest atmospheres in the world. In the evening, with the trade winds blowing through the gallery of the manager's house, and your feet up in a Berbice chair after a ride aback around the cultivations, and a boy to take your boots off and bring your slippers and a swizzle, you feel thoroughly at peace and comfortable. This shows how the workforce lived. I shall not try to explain how sugar is made, other than to say that cane is crushed in a mill to extract the juice, which goes into a factory where sugar is produced. The cane residue is called megas. And here we see the backyard of Enmore, with all the megas piled up ready for transporting by the estate tramway to the Logies. By 1870 Ludo Porter had returned to England, and with his departure, Harry, as well as being manager of Enmore, was made an attorney for Paradise and Resouvenir. His time in charge of Enmore coincided with significant changes in the sugar industry. In 1870, Britain introduced a new scale of duties on sugar imports to the disadvantage of low-grade producers. This served as an incentive to planters to invest in machinery in order to survive. By 1871, three-quarters of Guyana's plantations had been converted to the use of vacuum pans for making sugar. Here we see the inside of the sugar factory at Hampton Court, a colonial company estate in Essequibo. As the Porters always invested in their estates, Enmore was probably as up-to-date as this. Vacuum pans had been installed in the Enmore factory by Tom Porter as early as 1844, but not without a lot of teething problems. At Enmore, Harry Stokes and James Cook ran a good ship. Even their rum was good, although there was little market for it in England. There was a depression in the sugar market in the early 1870s, but there were record crops in 1876 and 77. The higher income received in 1876 led to increased expenditure on machinery, and soon almost all BG's sugar estates had been equipped with steam engines. In more difficult markets it became increasingly important for the shipping of produce, importing of supplies and selling of sugar, and the finance involved in all these activities to be handled efficiently. So in the early 1870s, porters moved their town agency to Booker's, a very sound business house with a good reputation in Liverpool. Companies like Booker's, Sandbach Parker and the Colonial Company had large wharves in Georgetown. They shipped vast amounts of produce to the markets in Britain. Here we see bags of sugar, barrels of rum and bricks on the Colonial Company's wharf. There was also, sadly, a dark side. In 1878, Harry's father-in-law, James Cook, died, and Harry inherited from him a small sugar estate on the Essequibo coast called Hoostatiran. This was an ill-fated addition to his assets, and does not reflect well on James Cook or Harry, who should have taken a closer interest in the estate. As a Booker partner observed in 1879, Hoostatiran has ruined everyone that touched it. I wish Mr. Stokes would be induced to sell it for what it will bring. Harry should have heeded the advice, for Hoostatiran came to an abrupt end. A massive explosion in its Heath Robinson sugar factory resulted in horrific injuries and the deaths of 5 black women. This must have been embarrassing, but the Stokes families continued their congenial lives on the East Coast, where Harry was now also the attorney for Enterprise, an estate belonging to the Hopkinson family. Enmore and Enterprise had different owners, but the same attorneys, town agents and engineer. These were halcyon days. There had been much tree planting, and Georgetown was becoming a noted garden city. Between 1879 and 1884, botanical gardens were laid out on the site of an old sugar plantation. The gardens still survive today and cover some 150 acres. Life in the town was equally colourful. Harry must have been a widely respected planter. In 1883, a writer in a Demerara newspaper said that few estates can point to a longer run of successful years than Enmore had under the management of Mr. Stokes. His ability gave him status in the Royal Agricultural and Commercial Society, which was Georgetown's business forum. In 1880, Josias Booker was president of the society, William Russell, the King of Sugar, the vice president, and J.S. Gordon, an ordinary director. Harry was a member of the Agriculture Committee along with these 3 and other leading planters, such as Edmund Field, Alan McAlmon, Tom Porter's partner, and Robert Kelly. As a young man, Kelly had trained under Cowsar at Enmore. By 1873, Harry's brother Alfred had also been enticed to Demerara and became an overseer at Enmore, and a few years later he was made deputy manager. In 1885, Alfred also married a Georgetown girl, Jessie Craig. Although they lived in Demerara, the 2 wives appear to have made regular visits to England. Harry's wife Marion gave birth to 2 daughters here in Woodbury in the 1880s, one birth being at Rose Cottage. Jessie had 5 of her 7 children in Woodbury, one of the births being at Sydney Cottage, and one at a house called Ailsa Cottage. Her father, John Brown Craig, lived at Ailsa House in Georgetown. Ailsa, that's an unusual name, and maybe that is the origination of the name of the Woodbury cottage. Well, John Brown Craig was a Scot. He was for 25 years the managing engineer of the Georgetown Waterworks. However, despite being a Scotsman, he now lies buried in Woodbury churchyard beside his daughter and her husband. So the close bonds of Demerara continue even after death. By 1880, after perhaps 20 years with the Porters, most of them at Enmore, Harry was a top-ranked planter. As attorney for 3 important estates, he was closely involved with the Booker partners, the estate's town agents, and was a figure in the Georgetown business community. At this point we meet Quintin Hogg. Hogg, a great moderniser, owned Nonpareil and Lusignan on Demerara's east coast. and through the Bel Air Company he also owned two large estates close to Georgetown, Bel Air and La Penitence, for which he built a central sugar factory. The Bel Air Company was very progressive, being the first to install subsoil drainage, the diffusion process in sugar making, and the electric light. At its peak, Bel Air made 6,000 tons of sugar a year. Henry Garnett, Hogg's personal representative in Guyana and main attorney, died in 1879. Shortly after Garnett's death, William Wolseley left Tom Porter's plantation farm to become manager of Hogg's Lusignan estate. 2 years later, Harry Stokes left Enmore to become the planting attorney for Bel Air and La Penitence, and general manager of the huge Bel Air estate. He really had reached the top. Alfred followed his brother, again as deputy, but also as manager of Cummings Lodge and Turkey End, two estates which fed cane to the central factory. Life at Bel Air must have been pleasant for the first 4 years. This scene was photographed at a tennis party there. If we zoom in a little, the photo is also interesting because one of the overseers is Rashley Porter, who was a son of Henry Aylmer Porter mentioned previously. When a visit of the West Indian Cricket 11 to England was planned in 1886, the players in mind for the team included 7 members of the Georgetown Cricket Club, which is incidentally the oldest cricket club in the West Indies. One of the practice matches for the tour was played in Demerara between an 11 from the Georgetown Cricket Club and Mr. Rashley Porter's East Coast 11. On the list for the trip was Russell Garnett, a good fast overarm bowler who was the son of Henry Garnett. In the event, the trip to England never took place. West Indian first-class cricket had begun only 20 years before this, with a game between Barbados and Demerara. So these were early cricket stars, as well as being plantation hierarchy. Plantations were close communities, and the white population, a long way from home, entertained each other with parties, tennis, and hunting in the bush. Guyana was generally a wonderful place for an Englishman or Scotsman to be in the early 1880s, with many social and recreational activities. Harry and Marion's sons Quintin and George were born at Bel Air. This beautiful silver bowl, which is still with the Stokes family in Glasgow, commemorates the birth of George Duncan Campbell Stokes on the 27th of January 1884. Harry was fortunate as his advancement took place when things were going well in the sugar industry. The third member of the Stokes family to go to Demerara was Caroline, a sister of Harry and Alfred, who went out to marry William Matthews. Their marriage was at St Mark's Church, Enmore, in September 1876. William Matthews came from Clisson Mary, where his father was the miller at St Thomas Oil Mills. William began as an overseer at Enmore when Harry Stokes was the manager, and by 1876 he was the manager himself of Resouvenir. When Harry and Alfred moved to Bel Air, he succeeded Harry as attorney and manager of Enmore, after he had been in Demerara for about 9 years. The winter of 1880-81 must have been quite a family occasion in Woodbury. Harry and Alfred moved to the largest sugar estate in BG, and William Matthews was made manager of Enmore. And Marion Stokes gave birth to a daughter at Rose Cottage in Woodbury in November 1880, and Caroline Matthews had a son in Woodbury also in mid-February 81. In total, William and Caroline had 10 children, 2 born at Resouvenir, 4 at Enmore, 3 in Devon, and 1 on the high seas. Obviously there was a bit of miscalculation for that one. Leaving the Stokes family for a moment, we move on to some other names. One I know little about is Farrant, which is commonly found around here. In 1851, a Newton Abbot corn merchant named Farrant had in his house a 1-year-old nephew who had been born in Demerara, and 20 years later an overseer called Farrant was at Enmore. There was also an overseer called Farrant at Plantation, Wales in 1894. So if anyone has any information on Farrant's going to Demerara, my colleague John in particular would love to hear about it. Woodbury sent 2 more brothers to BG. As Harry Stokes was now part of the hog commercial empire, it is likely he had a hand in persuading the first one to go there. William Phillips Ebbles and Frederick C. Ebbles were sons of Frederick Ebbles, the Exton miller, and his wife Elizabeth. After the death of her husband, Elizabeth became landlady of the White Hart in Woodbury, where at the age of 16 William was brewing beer for his mother. By the age of 20 he was working on Quintin Hogg's plantation Nonpareil. He worked alongside a young man named Harry Garnett, brother of Russell the cricketer. A few years later Ebbles was joined in Demerara by his brother Frederick. The Garnett's father, Quintin Hogg's right-hand man in Demerara in the 1870s, lived here in Minto House in Georgetown. When his father died, Harry Garnett became a ward of Hogg and lived with the Hoggs for 7 years, being regarded as an adopted son. By the end of the 1880s he was the manager of Nonpareil. The Garnett boys also had a sister Kate, seen here. As an overseer at Nonpareil, William Ebbles must have impressed Harry Garnett and Hogg. Not only did he follow Harry as manager of Nonpareil, he also married Sister Kate. This is the interior of St George's Cathedral, where they were married in 1896. It is one of the largest and highest wooden buildings in the world. By now the Woodbury links with Demerara were about to come to an end. Sadly, by the time the Ebbles brothers arrived in Demerara, life was no longer idyllic. The world was not the same after sugar prices crashed in 1884. All was not going well on the estates. Wages paid to free workers at Turkey Inn were from 4 to 8 cents a day, when the statutory minimum for the indentured labourers imported from India was 24 cents a day. This was not necessarily a criticism of Alfred or Harry, for Hogg was a hard taskmaster, and planters across the board were saving money, but it just shows how bad the situation had become. However, it appears that Harry had a few problems of his own. It appears from an advertisement in 1886 for the London Medical Battery Company that despite the good life he lived in Demerara, all was not perfect. He therefore took up a little advertising. It is tempting to say that he should have tried a local curry, but I suspect he may have been in the early stages of more serious illness. At least it seemed to have solved the immediate problem. The sea was always a constant threat to the plantations lying immediately to the east of Georgetown. This view of the area in 2005 shows just how flat the land is. In 1873, Bel Air, which lay a few miles west of here, was endangered. Hogg said that he spent over £80,000, approaching $5 million in today's money, on sea defences at Bel Air between 1873 and 1879. As long as the defences were in good order, Bel Air flourished. But in February 1886 a huge breach of the sea dam flooded the estate where Alfred Stokes' wife had given birth to a son 2 months before. Bel Air was almost underwater right up to the manager's residence, and Alfred was manager of Cummings Lodge and Turkey Inn. The scene would have been very similar to this. We can perhaps understand Jessie's next child in 1888 being born in Woodbury. Alfred, after roughly 15 years in Demerara, had now returned home to be a farmer. He and Jessie were buried here in Woodbury. Harry moved from Bel Air at about the time it was flooded. By 1887 he was the manager and Quintin Hogg's partner in ownership of Dekindron, an estate on the west coast, which Hogg had recently acquired. This was his home in the late 1880s. Any planter working for Quintin Hogg lived in style, and Harry was at Dikindren when Marion gave birth to their son Charles early in 1888. The post-1884 depression saw the number of operating sugar plantations fall from 105 to 46 in 20 years. 42 were abandoned and 17 amalgamated with neighbouring estates. The 1870s had been relatively peaceful years on the sugar estates, but the pressures of the sugar crisis in the mid-80s produced strikes. Then in 1888 there were riotous disturbances at several estates, including Hogg's Nonpareil and Turkey N and Porter's Enmore plantation. Farm was also affected, but luckily Tom Porter had already sold his Demerara interests. The disturbance at Nonpareil was a comparatively small domestic affair amongst the East Indians on the estate, but elsewhere estate officials were sometimes badly beaten, although fortunately there was no loss of life. At Enmore, in a dispute over wages, indentured Indians went to the cane fields to prevent the free Indians, who had accepted a lower rate of pay from working. In January 1889 there was also a disturbance at Dikindren, which would have not helped Harry Stokes if he was unwell. As this was generally not a happy period in the sugar industry, it is no surprise to find that our Woodbury planters began to leave. In 1888, not long after Alfred Stokes had left Demerara, William and Caroline Matthews also returned to England. William was only 36, but according to his youngest daughter, she said he was a broken man, full of fever and pretty helpless. The riotous disturbances could well have given him a nervous breakdown, and he may even have been affected by yellow fever, as the managers of 2 other plantations had died of it during the 1881 outbreak. When William died in 1903, allegedly of fish poisoning, he was a sick man in poor circumstances. In his retirement he had joined the Plymouth Brethren, maybe influenced by Leonard Strong of old, who did the same. 2 of the Matthews boys were educated at a Brethren boarding school, one becoming a doctor. In their retirement, William and Caroline lived at Littleham. Caroline died in 1947, aged 92, outliving Matthew by some 45 years. So, Alfred Stokes and William Matthews had left Demerara. What happened to Harry Stokes? The 1889 directory lists him at Dikindren as joint proprietor and attorney and manager with Quintin Hogg. He was also a vestryman and the organist at St. Luke's Scots Kirk. A son was born in November 1891, when Marion was described as the wife of H.T. Stokes of Dikindren. So we may assume that he was still alive and on the west coast at that time. This birth, however, took place in Glasgow. The 1892 directory shows the proprietors of Dikindren as Quintin Hogg and heirs of H.T. Stokes. So it appears that Harry died in 1891 or early in 1892, as by 1896 Henry Campbell was Hogg's co-proprietor of Dikindren. In the 1901 census, Marion and her children were living in Glasgow, and with them was her mother, Sarah Cook. Marion and Sarah were both described as widows. Also present was William and Caroline Matthews' daughter, Lily Matthews, who was visiting her aunt and cousins, so the close bond between the planters' families still existed back home. Hogg too began to think of leaving. The flood and market disasters were too much for him, and he decided that maintaining protection from the sea was no longer worth the expense. He lost interest, and in 1892 sugar cultivation at Bel-Air ceased. Things on the estate got worse. In October 1896 another riot occurred at Nonpareil, when 5 indentured Indian labourers were shot and killed, and 59 wounded by trigger-happy police officers who fired on a mob which rushed them. This was not a happy event for the recently married William Ebbles. Part of the reason for the discontent at Nonpareil was the continued slashing of wages. The estate was paying about 2 cents below the statutory minimum. Another reason was the illicit relationship of Nonpareil's deputy manager with an Indian woman, and her husband was one of those killed in the riot. It was reported that Harry Garnett, the attorney, and William Ebbles, now the manager, had refused to discipline the deputy manager, hence the riot. Less than 2 years after this riot, William Ebbles had also moved on. In 1898, Quintin Hogg visited his expanding interests in Ceylon and the East, including Mauritius. In the same year, he severed all his business links with the West Indies and British Guiana, including his interest in Hogg, Curtis, Campbell and Company. In 1898, after 13 years in Demerara and about 4 years as manager, William Ebbles also went to Mauritius, where he became manager of the Beauséjour sugar estate. The locomotive seen here was used at Beauséjour in the 1900s, when he was there. The estate is still in operation, although merged with a neighbour. William Ebbles did well, and by 1923 was the director of the Anglo-Ceylon and General Estates Company Limited. He also became a director of Trinidad Sugar Estates Limited. Many BG planters moved east, and at least 3 of the Teshamaker family I mentioned earlier settled in New Zealand as early as the 1850s. The man who was William Ebbles' head overseer at Nonpareil was planting cotton in Egypt in the 20th century. Frederick Ebbles, who stayed on in Demerara, was head overseer at the Campbell's Ogle estate in 1904. What became of him after that I have not discovered. A brief mention of one more family. Remember Ludovic Porter and the clerical Holes. George Hole was succeeded as rector of Chumley by the Reverend George Bethune. Hole had 2 daughters. One married Porter and the other married Bethune, so it is no surprise to find 3 Bethune sons going to Demerara to work for Uncle Ludo. Here we will only mention George Maximilian Bethune, who became his sugar planting career in about 1872 as an overseer at Cane Grove. When William Matthews was made manager of Enmore in 1882, Bethune followed him as attorney/manager at Resouvenir. When Matthews returned to England, Bethune succeeded him as resident attorney and manager of Enmore, where he remained until he too returned to England in about 1910. So from 1866 to 1910, Enmore was run by Harry Stokes, William Matthews and George Bethune in succession. Each served at Resouvenir beforehand, and like Harry Stokes, Bethune was a member of the vestry of St Paul's parish. He was also churchwarden of St Mark's Enmore, and on his retirement he lived in Bedford, where he joined an evangelical group, an interesting change, comparable perhaps with that made by William Matthews. Maybe all the aforementioned people were affected by the conditions in which the indentured Indian labourers lived, which would have been bad after the collapse of the sugar industry in 1884. The housing for Indian workers was similar to this, with earth floors. It was not, of course, in such a state of dereliction in the 1880s. By Victorian standards, the conditions then experienced by the Indians on sugar estates were not completely bad, and it is unfair to judge them by the expectations of people today. But it has to be said that someone living in the style to which a manager was accustomed in the Stokes and Bethune period must have given an Indian immigrant living in a range on a few cents much food for thought. Times have changed, and the estates are no longer as they were. Enmore, the Henry Porter's estate, remained in Booker hands until the departure of the company from Guyana in 1976. All the estates now belong to the Guyana Sugar Corporation, and small is no longer beautiful. The corporation has incorporated Enmore, La Bonne Intention, Nonpareil, Ogle, Souvenir, Diamond, and Tom Porter's Farm, etc., into one huge estate. The Booker Company, of course, still has major trading businesses in the UK, with one large warehouse on the Southern Industrial Estate in Exeter. This is the modern version of the same company which operated in Demerara, marketing the sugar exports for the plantation owners. I will close with a brief look at Georgetown. By the 1900s, the town known by Ludo Porter and Harry Stokes in 1860 had also changed. Cricket was a major recreational activity. The Georgetown Cricket Club's ground at Burda was said to be the only test match ground below sea level. Teams from Britain played here in the 1890s, and there were other sophisticated facilities in the town: a racecourse, a turf club, a golf club, the Georgetown Club, and the Georgetown Philharmonic Club. Hobbies included a chess club, a rowing club, and a dramatic society. Freemasonry thrived, as it had always been a source of mutual support to men far from home. The commercial centre of town, Water Street, had developed considerably by the 1900s. Booker's head office would have been well known to the Stokes, Ebbles and Batoon brothers, as the company's stores would have been frequented by their wives. The clerks would have been white and the customers would have been fawned over. Sadly, much of that Georgetown has gone. Fires such as the one in 1945 destroyed many fine old wooden buildings. This is the scene the planters would have known well, and which they would have no doubt frequented. And it looked like this in 1910. And like this one sad day in 1945. The fire having begun here in Booker's drugstore across the road. The Booker's store was replaced by this building, which was where my colleague John worked for a number of years in the 1960s. Unfortunately, more recent civil strife and other misfortunes have also played their part to destroy what was known by the planters and their families. As records relating to Guyana are difficult to access and not comprehensive, may I ask anyone who can add to our knowledge of these families, or tell us of any others with Demerara links, to please get in touch with me, or I can direct you to John, who is really the expert in this story. We would be delighted to learn more. Finally, we owe a huge thank you to a lady known only as Aunt Rose, who left photographs and documents with names on them. She was a daughter of William and Caroline Matthews. Also the granddaughter of William and Caroline, who was a niece of Aunt Rose, and Graham Stokes in Glasgow, whose father was a son of Harry Stokes, and was one of the 3 children born at Dakindron. These two enabled us to piece together this story and supplied a large number of the family and estate photographs that we have used. It still amazes me that 160 years ago, local teenagers, which is all they were at the time, traversed the globe to such foreign parts in sailing ships which took a couple of months getting there. Even today it would be a major journey to go to Demerara by modern means of transport. Yet they came home to have babies and returned again and again. I believe they'd all been tempted by the thought of making their fortunes. Maybe some of the plantation owners did, but many of those who worked on the estates came back almost broke, in poor health, and died very young, despite living the good life whilst there. However, I hope you have found it an interesting, if not unusual, story.